Welcome to the Wheeler Centre for another Text in the City event. A couple of things by way of introduction. My name's Tony Birch. I'm here today on behalf of the Wheeler Centre. In my other life, I teach in the writing program at the University of Melbourne and write short stories and novels. But today we're here to discuss a text that I think we've found remarkable, or those who have read it, Dear America, Letters from Vietnam. And today we're very fortunate to have a guest, I think, who comes to us with such a wealth of experience to discuss this book. Our guest today is Barry Hurd. Barry Hurd is a writer who has published several books, and for us, importantly, a book about his experience in Vietnam. Well Done, Those Men is the title of that book. That book, by the way, is soon to be made into a feature film. Barry and I were talking about this out the back. There are many exciting aspects of this film that will be made, I think, in about 12 months' time, start production. And Barry is going to be played by the actor Hugo Weaving. So I think you're better looking than that, Barry, but you can't have everything. And just again, talking to Barry, it's remarkable. One of the things you understand is the incredible journey that people take, and Barry has taken an incredible journey from a childhood, or certainly a young life in country, to Victoria, to being called up and serving in Vietnam, living with the terrible aftermath of that, but being, I would say, very obviously courageous, very intellectual and creative person who has turned that experience into something of value for himself, and certainly something of value for all of us who read his work and, of course, discuss books such as this today. One of the things I wanted to start with, Barry, reading the letters and thinking about just reflecting on them, of someone, of course, about 10 years younger than you, who certainly has no direct experience of this, and I would think for most people, just reading the letters, what was your general impression about them, and possibly your general impression about them relative to your own experience in Vietnam?
Two things. When I wrote home, which I did probably once a month, I always spoke about the weather and how big the bleachers were, and probably how dense the jungle was, and that was about it. I had a girlfriend at the time, and I used to write very milky, romantic letters home, totally denying the reality of my own experience. The other side of that was the best part of that whole war for most of us was to get a letter. And ironically, because I come from a country area, the high country actually, where we had no television, no radio, even the newspapers were a couple of days late, most of my family in the local district were prolific letter writers. And I became a centre of attention, not me, but my letters, where guys would come over and I'd let them read all the letters. But getting back to the question, Tony, my other reaction, there were several. One was I found quite a bit of spirituality in the letters, and I mean Christian subtlety, where the word God or Jesus or what have you was being mentioned, which I can assure you you'd never hear that with the Australian soldiers, unless it was blasphemy or whatever. And the other is the emotive side of the letters towards the end of the book highlighted something for me, how we were so different as Australian soldiers to the Americans from my own experience of mixing with them.
When you say the emotional or emotive side of the letters, so what could you just tease out that difference a little more? So was it a notion that the Australian soldiers were less forthcoming emotionally, or?
Yeah, without a doubt. In the book it states right at the beginning how in this particular war the Americans were the most highly trained of any American soldiers, and yet they had a system like us of conscription, and some of the conscripts had only been in the army 16 weeks when they were actually in combat. and whereas your average Australian soldier would be 12 months training before we actually went to Vietnam. And I guess what I'm saying is by the time we got there, we believed we were highly trained, very efficient, not at killing, but at doing our job. Whereas my experience of meeting young Americans when I was over there is they were very, the word gung-ho is not meant to be an insult, but almost Hollywood-like in a lot of their attitudes, etc. And the point I want to lead to from that is in the jungle where you unfortunately have to ambush and kill, is during my time, and that part is mentioned quite a bit in the book, the whole thing was numbers, who got the most kills. And with us, we were very proud of our numbers. My company, I was in a battalion with 4 companies, if we got the most kills, we had free grog when we got back into camp. Instead of a black and white pornographic movie, we'd have a coloured one. And it was all sort of like grand final sort of accolades. We didn't cheer and carry on, but killing and what have you didn't affect us at all. And my point being, I guess, which you can't as a young soldier write in a book and say this, but I strongly believe to be a good soldier you must have no spirit and no soul. And I think the Army very successfully took that away from us. And so as soldiers in the war in Vietnam, we were very efficient. Whereas with the Americans, I felt they were very young. As conscripts like us, I believe that they did get the lower end of the, and I've read this, I must admit, this is not my experience, the lower end of the socio-economic people, whereas with the Australian National Service, I think it was the opposite. I think we were the top. I actually do believe we were the sort of the cream. And if you can see what I'm trying to put together here, that it's reflected in the letters after killing or things go wrong, etc., that some of the letters are very emotive, and I honestly don't know of anyone, not that you necessarily share it, but even now as we're older and my mates, we talk a lot more about more personal stuff. I don't think that would have happened very often with Australian soldiers, the emotiveness towards the end with the letters.
There are, I mean, that's interesting because there is such a variance in the letters, and the point that you touch on, and you know, again, this is not a criticism, but it is shocking to hear that the more kills you get, the more grog you get, or you get a coloured pornographic movie. It is a shocking reality, and I want to talk about the impact of that as well. But one of the things I was interested in fact, was the way that some of the letters did, in fact, seem to me to use letter writing to put people at ease and even dismiss what was happening when what was really happening was much more damaging. And there's a Corporal, Michael Boston, who writes in 1967, and writing home to his parent from the hospital after he'd been injured, he says, "Don't worry too much about me because I'm doing great." Now, what we realise, in fact, he is in hospital with an injury, but then when we look, this is in Da Nang, when we look at what happened to him afterwards, is that this same officer was, he received a disability pension for the enormous post-traumatic stress he had suffered in Vietnam. So it seems in that case, and in some of the letters, there is something a little bit akin to what you're referring to, in that some soldiers are writing back, creating fictions for their families so that they don't get stressed about what's actually happening. Was that an experience you would know well?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting, just taking a big step back in history. I wrote a book on horses in World War I, and it involved me reading literally hundreds of diaries and journals at the War Memorial to do with the soldiers. And not only did those soldiers write back a pack of lies about what was going on, but they used words like gosh and golly and damn and jollied, and it was, you could see, if you read the letters that I read in those journals, you would think they were over there on a picnic. You would not realise that the reality of the war. And now moving through to what was in the letters regards to what was actually happening. I said at the beginning, I always told lies, but I do think there's a point where I think with the Americans, I'm not sure here, but I think with the Americans it was like a grenade going off in your face, whereas I think with us we had to close down completely. And what I'm getting at is I had an incident in Vietnam that was really bad. I lost a lot of mates, and when in the book I wrote not much about what actually happened, but I wrote about the effects of what happened, and I made a couple of comments, and one of them in the book I said, when I looked around, all I could see was old men. And when I said in the book, how would I explain what I've just been through, looking back at the jungle, and I used one word, shit. And that's all I said. And I guess what I was trying to say is we went as highly trained, loving killing very quickly, loving the accolades very quickly, we were the best, to where we didn't even have that emotion in the finish, and we were just old men just doing a job. And the thing that's so hard, that again sort of distracted me a bit in the letters, is this cold, hard, unemotional, drunken, whatever you want to call him, young soldier, who changed from an innocent young country boy to this hardened man. That's the person that came back to his mum and dad and his girlfriend and all of his friends. And I don't know how, if I'd been asked to write a letter, I can't go back and think exactly how I was, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gone as you've gone there. Yeah.
Can I ask you, I mean, there's something, I suppose, well, worrying might be too strong a word, but I just want to read a paragraph from the introduction by Senator John McCain, who we all know of, who himself was a Vietnam veteran. And I want to ask you about something about writing, and I suppose the way that people talk about war, Barry. He writes, "Nowhere is the truth more eloquently expressed than in this collection of letters from Vietnam. In earlier times, letters and poetry from the Western Front told the world how the Great War stole the souls of a lost generation." Now that is itself very eloquent, and I don't think there's no doubt the incredible devastation of the Great War. It did steal more than the souls of a lost generation. It stole millions of young men. But in a way, when we talk about war in these eloquent or even poetic terms, do we in fact learn from it anything about how difficult it is, or is the poetry itself problematic in the sense it might create a romantic image of war that really keeps it as distant as a fiction might?
No. I think the saddest thing, as an old man, and I'm pushing 70, I know I look about 45, but I'm actually, that's not very funny. I actually think I look 45, but one of the things when the mateship you make in the army, and it's very hard to explain, but it's much closer than being married. If you're married, you go and work, or your wife works, or this and that. You might be together 15 hours a week, intimately. In the army, 24 hours a day. And what I'm getting at is we have not only maintained that friendship, we're very passionate, we're very loving, we're very caring, we're so bloody anti-war you wouldn't believe it. I think we're all gay, the whole lot of us. But
the RSL love that quote, John Barry.
Thank you. But I shake my head in disbelief at what our stupid fucking politicians do, and creating war and having wars, and whether it's Julia or Tony flying over Afghanistan, gun your guys, and it's wrong. We can put a man on the moon. We can. I had a grandchild born in February that was 13 weeks premature. When I was a young man, and one of the problems we had coming back from Vietnam, a lot of our wives had miscarriages and that sort of thing, and we expected that occasionally. And yet that child lived and is healthy, and so we're a highly intelligent human being? No, we're not. We're bloody animals. We can't negotiate at a very simple level and work out a solution. No, we go and blow Baghdad to buggery or whatever. So that's a bit passionate. I'm sorry.
But I think that's relative to the point, because you talk about politicians, and when I read the McCain introduction, I mean, there's some, you understand that he was a vet, etc. But it does remind me of the sort of language that the Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes used in the First World War when Australian troops were being mowed down at the front. He spoke about them as Roman gods. Well, these were just kids from country Victoria, and they weren't giving their souls to some higher power. They were dying and their families were suffering. I think that's the point I'm getting at. We can, as readers of a book who don't have that direct experience of what you call the shit in the jungle, we can be misled by language, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, with World War One, if you were, this doesn't apply to Gallipoli, I must add, but in France, if you were put at the front and you were there for, say, 3 or 4 days, you could come back after that, if you survived, for maybe 6 or 8 weeks in relative safety. And I think one of the problems of Vietnam, which has never been expressed very clearly, but when people say to me, what was the worst thing about being in the jungle, was waiting for something to happen. The stress or the level of every tree or every step or something could go wrong, which is correct, and yet nothing would go wrong. And maybe for the whole 5 days we're in the jungle living like an animal, we may have 20 minutes of action. But that time of waiting was so intense and so, I don't know, stressful or something, that I think the thing we're talking about with PTSD and letters and emotion, I think it built up very, very quickly. I explain to students, which I see there's a few here, it's like you and me in a car and we're driving to Perth, which might take 5 days. That's the 5 days in the jungle. You need to be aware that during that 5 days we're going to have 5 rollovers in the motor car. When? I don't know. Is someone going to get hurt? I hope to God not. And what happens when the rollover's finished and there's blood and guts and everything? You get up and keep going. And that's sort of the analogy I use. It's quite frightening when it happens, but in fact sometimes it's a relief that something has actually happened.
Yeah. Can I ask you, this is in relationship to killing. There's a letter I want to read, a couple of pieces out by Robert Ranson, written on the 27th of March 1968. I want to read the 2 excerpts and then put a point to you, please, Barry. There are, of course, those who just get a real charge out of killing people. One lieutenant I talked to said what a kick it had been to roll a gook 100 yards down the beach with his machine gun. So there's one point of view. But this is the same person responding himself to how he sees the enemy, as we'll call them. I now have one last editorial comment about the war and then I'll sign off. I'm extremely impressed by almost every report I've heard about the enemy. I am about to go and fight. He is a master of guerrilla warfare and is holding his own rather nicely with what should be the strongest military power in the world. But it is mostly his perseverance that amazes me. He works so hard and has been doing so for so long. You've heard of his tunnelling capability. A captured VC said that in coming from North Vietnam down to Saigon, he walked over 200 miles completely underground. Anyone who would dig a 200-mile tunnel and who would still do it after being at war for 30 years must be right. Now, not so much that, well, it won't be the political point of view, but in relationship to those 2 views of an enemy, my immediate reaction would be, oh yeah, it'd be easier to kill someone if you devalue them and you call them a gook and you can boast about rolling them downhill with a shotgun. But it seems to me he doesn't shy away from the fact that he is going to fight this enemy, but he still has, in that last phrase, or that last paragraph, real respect for them. Yeah. I mean, when you talked about it in the sense of, but I suppose what army leadership is doing for you to, in a sense, leach you with emotion, but how going into battle, is it a case of having to devalue humanity, or is it a case of not being able to deny humanity? How does that work?
Yeah, well, what you just read to me, I couldn't have written that till I was about 55-year-old, I don't think. the subtlety of the first part of the army is when we went to Vietnam, they were the enemy, but when we were there, we not only were told they were gooks and all sorts of quite disgusting names, but if we went near a village, what would the first thing you'd see? The kids would come to you and beg you for food. They would beg you for cigarettes. The mothers would be quite happy to sell their daughters to you for sex, for 6 or 8 cigarettes. They would pick your pockets, etc., etc. So, and this is like a Collingwood supporter now or whatever, you'd have this really biased attitude toward these lowly yellow scum. That's all they were. They were gooks. And it was, like I was saying, you know, about Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott, and why doesn't one of them stand up and say, well, we're the first country in the world, we're not going to have an army or a navy or anything. That's it. And the point I guess I'm getting at is, perhaps I may have had the odd flash of, gee, these poor people, but no, the general consensus was that's how you talked, to fit in the mob. And yet it was so obvious they were starving, they had no jobs, they had no power, they had no schooling, they had no hospitals, they had nothing. But honestly, none of us could see it. And not only that, when we came home as young men, our hatred towards the Vietnamese, particularly when Malcolm Fraser opened the gates and let in those first refugees, we hated them with a passion. For what reason? Because of the indoctrination we'd received. And now, if you go to Vietnam and say you're an Australian, and I feel the same, the Vietnamese people honour us. They think we're wonderful, which is quite confusing. But yeah, the subtlety of it's like the boat people, I guess, is a good example today. You know, go and read The Rug Maker if you want to read what it's like to be. That's one example as a refugee. It's very, you know, sort of right on the edge sometimes to see people that are suffering and feel sorry for them. And as a soldier, no way did we ever.
I mean, look, I'm really interested in taking this a little further, because one of the things that I actually was going to ask about the letters before Barry and I talked out the back, is that one of the things that interests me for the soldiers who survived the war is to look at what they're doing now. So often they were working as a lawyer in Brooklyn or working for a particular agency. People like yourself who had gone back to Vietnam and were funding orphanages, and Barry's involved in a project in Vietnam. So it seems to me that those who, when you look at their letters, you get that, at times, that same sense of hardness or a steely resolve that, you know, to devalue the enemy. And yet you see a lot of these men in later years working what I would call in a humanitarian way. You said, well, I wouldn't have even been able to write that letter until I was 55. And I think just incredibly, for me, courageous for you to talk so honestly about your attitude at the time. Where's the transformation occur for people like you, where you find the way not only to question your experience, but you really, that must be so difficult because you've got to question yourself so deeply.
Yeah, it's. I'm very spiritual. I'm not Christian or godlike or anything. I'm extremely spiritual. I love meditation, which I learnt in the psychiatric ward. But one of the problems I believe any soldier anywhere is you either totally or partially lose your spirit and your soul. You don't exist. You're just a frame of a person. And how do I know this, I think, is because you can't explain it in your head or anything. But when you can explain it, is when you go to bed. You have the most horrific scenes, and your soul or your spirit, what's left of it, says, you are, excuse my language, a piece of shit. This is what I think of you. And the bulk of my 30 years after Vietnam varied from a nightmare nearly every night to certain times of the year, which are anniversaries, to appalling nightmares. And no one knew. When I'd wet the bed with sweat, or when I'd shake and scream out, my wife would say, you okay? And I'd say, just leave me alone. And what I learnt many years later when I started to I had nothing. I couldn't sleep very well. I was a workaholic. I'm very highly educated. You're supposed to be proud of that. No, I put too much energy into things that were not all that important and not my family. But in the psychiatric ward, I got back my soul and my spirit. Today, I actually like who I am. I like what I do. All of us at the moment, my Vietnam vet mates that are left, we're very, very involved in fundraising and giving. And what do I look like, a good guy or a good doer? No, I'm not. But I find from giving, I get back so much. And, to me, to give, if I'm lined up at a bank waiting to get served or something and there's a woman there holding a baby, you should say, look, you go in front of me. Is that much to ask? And I'm not being a gentleman or anything. And that's just the beginning of my life. And when Tony mentioned the orphanages, with the film we were talking of setting up a hospital in Vietnam because the film we believe is going to be quite successful. I'm not sure. But in the throes of it, we've gone to Africa to manage a hospital, voluntary. And a good friend who's gone, one of my very close mates, emailed me and said, Baz, Vietnam's a bloody paradise. He said, this place is the place that needs help. And so we've changed our hats completely. And just yesterday and last week, we're setting up another foundation. And can you hear my passion and I wish all humans could do that, and we'd, it'd be such a beautiful world. And I'm not saying I'm a good person, but you have to think like that. You have to realise that owning a flash car and a big house is nothing. I have everything I want. I have a wife and 3 beautiful children and 4 grandchildren, and that's it. If that makes millions, then I'd say a hospital's going to be very lucky. I'm pointing to the film. And that's how it should be.
Okay, what we're going to do now, I want to just take a note of a couple of letters in particular that I want to make a comment on, but then we're going to have question time, and I just really do think with the privilege of having Barry with us, I'm sure that I'd like you to direct questions toward Barry directly. And also, when we finish at 5:15, we've got a little time left. If you want to come and ask more questions to Barry, I'm sure he'd be willing to do that. And he does have some of his books with him
got a
here.
couple there if you want.
If you want to have a look at them. What I'd like to, just before we go to question time, is take a couple of notes, which I think are out of interest. There's a letter on page 237, which begins at the bottom there and goes over to 238, written by Edmund Fanning, and it's a letter that he writes home. And I think it's one of those letters when all the fiction of this book, or a lot of it, is stripped away. He doesn't talk about the war, he doesn't talk about the enemy, he just talks to his loved one about just wanting to be home. And I think when I read that letter, it was that for me, you just get that sense of this is the true heartfelt experience where someone is stripping away any artifice and just writes about wanting to be home in a very honest and direct way. And the other one is a terrible example of, I suppose, the ordinariness around, or the unexpectedness around some deaths. And we do forget sometimes that when we're talking about war, it's not just about soldiers on the front, but there was a wonderful letter here written by a nurse, Sharon A. Lane, who was a nurse, and she writes to her parents. It's one of those letters where a letter could be written from anywhere, in a way that you could be on holiday almost. It says, read a book last night and missed a good Lee Marvin movie at the mess hall. Had a movie star visit the 2nd or 3rd week here, named Ricardo Montalban. Not sure who he is. Have you ever heard of him? Said he was in a movie with Esther Williams. Well, stop now, getting sleepy. See you sooner. And then we find out that she was killed a month later in an explosion. I think one of the things that letter highlights, Barry, is that when you talk about that, unexpectedness of being out in the jungle, and you don't know when the car's going to roll, to use the metaphor, is that often people, again, because we grow up on movies, we think war, every death is this grand explosion, and the platoon slow motion of William Dafoe going down, etc. I mean, people die when you're talking about the weather. People die when you're looking the other way. It's much more ordinary than that, and more devastating because of it, I would think.
Yeah, it's don't know how to explain it, but I guess I can highlight. I'll talk about war, which I don't like talking about, but when they bragged, the Americans, in the letters, not so much brag, but it was mentioned, and we had the same philosophy of the most number of kills. If you really think logically about that statement, you don't have any prisoners. That's what the most number of kills mean. And when you don't have any prisoners in a jungle, what does that mean when the Viet Cong, the enemy, would often call into villages and capture families and make the family go with them? And when the family's in the jungle and you're killing people, who are you actually killing? And if there are little people, which unfortunately there were, and they can escape quite quickly, how do you get another kill? You release the dog, and the dog finds the kid. And in my book that I wrote, and it was my turning point actually in my life, is my closest friend, the first person that he killed in a jungle with the dog watching was a 3-year-old girl with a machine gun. And that haunted him forever and ever and ever. And in the finish, it was the reason that he took his life. But I guess we somehow coped, we somehow come home very different. The letter you mentioned on 237 with the guy writing home to his wife and missing her. I used to write like that to my girlfriend until reality set in. And when I met her, very briefly, I rang her a week later and said, I never want to see you again. And I never have. Because to me, he was this beautiful, she was a very attractive young 21-year-old girl, talking about pop music and if she looked okay and did I like a dress and did I want to go out to a dance or something. And in my 12 months in Vietnam, a woman meant one thing to me, that's flat on their back and nothing else. And I'd lost all respect and everything thanks to the army. That's the only way. And see, if you have enough of that, that's who you end up as. And actual fact, I admire myself that I said, I don't want to see you again, because imagine what I would have been like as her husband or whatever. And again, I was surprised by that letter, reading that, and I thought, I wonder how he actually reacted when they met. Because I'll tell you, I'm going to swear, but can you imagine, I'm brought up, the biggest swear word in my language was probably bloody. This is on a farm in East Gippsland and growing up. And eventually coming home after Vietnam and having a tea, still no television, I think about 30 people, and I turned to my dad and say, can you pass the fucking sauce? And Mum fainted. She literally fainted. And everyone was sort of pretty stunned. And my father said, Barry, could you mind your language? And I said, what fucking language? I'm not speaking in code, because I used to carry a radio and speak in code. And I was really angry that he was jibing me, because I often answered in code. And they had to deal with all this, and it was very, very... My mother actually, from the day I got home till the day she passed away, was frightened of me. And when she passed away, and I was locked up at this stage in the psychiatric ward, about a month after I had my breakdown, which was, it meant wearing nappies and, total breakdown. When she passed away, and I wasn't there, but she said to one of my brothers, my Barry never come home, which I would say is very apt for most wars.
Thank you very much, Barry. So we've got 2 roving mics and we'd love some questions. So who would like to put a question to Barry, please? Yes.
Despite what you said about the Americans having a Hollywood attitude to the war, would you say that on the whole the letters were honest?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Part of how I'm struggling with coming to terms with reading the letters and then being an Australian was when I came back from Vietnam, and I only stayed at home for just over a week. I had to leave. I had to get away from Swifts Creek. I'd upset my family and all my friends, etc. And I came to Melbourne and I went to RMIT in the university. And I mated up with an American, by coincidence, a Vietnam veteran. And we sort of got along, but he couldn't follow a lot of the Australianisms that we have, including the way we talk, etc. But we got along very well. And when he went back to America after 2 years, he wrote me a letter and said, I'm going to send you something you will cherish the rest of your life. I used to lend him my car and he'd go up the farm and stay there. And he sent me a leather parchment of the Statement of Declaration of Independence. And I couldn't throw it in the bin quick enough. Because to me, the morons running that bloody country at the time in America, I couldn't. And can you see what I'm actually getting at? Is after all that experience and him knowing me and very Australian, you know, very not anti-political but very cynical towards a lot of politicians, he just worshipped any president, anything to do with America was God. It was the ultimate. And I still keep in touch with him, and he's still the same. And that's what I'm sort of frowning a bit and struggling with the letters. I see the subtlety of that in some of the letters that. You know, if you ask me in Australian history, I start going through them, and I think Harold Holt should be in jail. He's gone immediately, but John Howard should be in jail. Malcolm Fraser should have gone and do 6 weeks in the desert, and I could go on with politicians who I think are just disgusting. Whereas if my American friend would never have hinted, even Nixon, he was okay, apparently.
I mean, it's interesting because the term honesty is a really complex one in regard to the letters, I think, because I think one of the things that I found in the letters that express sort of even a sense of happiness, you don't know what they're masking to tell their parents, not to be concerned. But I think what Barry points out then, there is, I think, genuine naivety in many of the letters, but that's about a dishonest government. Not, of course, about dishonest letter writers. There's another question. Yes.
My question actually follows on from the one about honesty, and it connects with what you're talking about there, and it's the idea of how much can we trust what is written. You've just spoken yourself about these letters are, in many respects, people creating fiction for their loved ones back home, that they self-edit out the language they use. And we know from the author introduction that the letters are further edited to remove spelling mistakes and repetition. So beyond the letters that are very clear in their naivety, how much trust can we give in the rest of the anthology?
Yeah, I understand. And again, I'm not an expert, but I'll give you a personal example. I wrote home, as I was saying, not that often. I never had many opportunities, but it was always nothing to do with sympathy, like you'll see in a lot of those letters, but always about sweat and humidity. But we got ambushed in the jungle and really went through a bad time. And when we got back to base camp 6 days later, we were about a third of us had gone, and not all killed, but all sorts of messes. And the big boss grabbed me and said, "You're out of here." And the reason he did is because I carried a radio. You need to be aware, which is so different to today. But when we came into base camp, if someone had been killed in the jungle or wounded, how do you find out? You read the notice board in the base camp that says KIA, which is killed in action, or WIA, and what hospital they went to. No funeral, no service, no nothing. That was it. And so the guys would come to me because I was the senior radio operator and ask for details. I'd be the only one that would have all the details, and I wouldn't want to speak. I used to fight. I'd tell them to whatever and want to fight. So the boss got rid of me, and this is leading to your point. I got sent to Hong Kong for 5 days to get away. And when I got there, what's the first thing I did? I rang my mother from Hong Kong. I'm sure I used the F word and a few others, but I told her to get a pen and write down these names. And I said, go to my bedroom, there's a bloody diary there, and their addresses and phone numbers are there, and ring them up and tell their parents they're okay, and everything you read in the paper tomorrow will be bullshit. My dad said when Mum come back in, she was white with shock that this son of hers spoke to her like this. But can you hear what I was actually telling the absolute truth? Because we did read the odd paper, which was just crap. Another brave Australian, assault or whatever, or how we stood up and did this and that. We were petrified. I assumed I'd be dead. Most of us did, etc., etc. And I just wanted my mother to tell the parents of my mates that they actually have survived. That's all I need to know. And my poor mother had to... I don't think I could have written that. I had to say it on a phone. And Mum wouldn't speak for about a day. And then after that, she rang up the families. And by this time, the families were seeing that A Company 7 Battalion had been ambushed and it was a real mess. And for the moment, these guys were this and that. But 90% of what they're reading is how brave and courageous and the incredible fight we put up. And we were bloody lucky to get out of it. It was simple as that.
The other, at a broader, for students, it's interesting because I was talking to Barry about this. I taught history at Melbourne University for several years and actually did a PhD in history, and I've actually published work on letters. And I would say for students is that you've got to look at the overall collection of letters, interpret the letters, and certainly not, I don't think it's an issue of a ledger, is this fiction, is this fact, how much is this embellished as opposed to that one. I think it's about getting a sense of what mood are the letters attempting to create, what atmosphere are they written in, what's the political climate they're responding to, and what might be driving someone to write in a particular way to a loved one, a family member, etc. So I think there's a lot of interpretation needed, and I think a lot of context. So I would suggest that you would look at these letters in relationship to other understandings of the Vietnam War at the time, whether it be newspaper reportage, whether it be books that have been written, and then come to some conclusion, which I would expect for you would be a complex reading of the letters and certainly not a simple fact or fiction. Look, we've got time for one quick question if there is one. Who would like to... Down the back there. So a quick question and a quickish response.
G'day, Barry. Given you spoke about the honesty of what's contained in those letters, and I just want to sort of bring it forward to maybe a younger generation of servicemen who are overseas now who there's not a culture of letter writing, and electronic media is, you don't write down anything, you don't want anyone to see. Is a younger generation of servicemen who are overseas now, are they going to have the opportunity to record that raw, visceral sort of record of what they're going through? Or do you think that they will just have to keep it inside and any post-traumatic stress sort of problems they've got might be compounded further?
I can answer it in 3 blunt statements. I didn't write a book. I wrote a letter to my wife in a psychiatric ward because she'd been told, and I'd been told, I had 3 months to live. The letter was to try and honestly tell her what a stuffed up whatever I'd been most of my life, and as far as I could see, why. The writing made me better. In the finish, because several people read the letter I wrote and it got passed around, that we didn't realise this, we came under so much pressure that we published and it became a book. I was not happy with that. But this is how I'd answer your question now. Today I've had over 100,000 emails on that book. I've had 32,000 letters on that book. In the last 5-6 years, because the book's been out 8 going on 9 years, they are all from young men like you're talking about. And what has happened, they've gone struggling to a doctor, a psychiatrist or whatever, and invariably that book will somehow end up in their hands, and it encourages them to perhaps not write, but talk about, and write if you can, about your experience and start to forgive yourself and understand that you're not the animal you thought you were or whatever, because that's what PTSD actually is. It's, as I said, your soul and your spirit arguing and fighting, and you get very depressed and anxious. some of the emails in particular, I must admit I probably got about 200 or 300 letters from particularly Iraq originally. They're eloquent, they're written very honestly, I'm not a good writer. My publisher said I'm the worst bloody writer he's ever met in his life. Because my background's mathematics and physics and science. But I think what your point is about not being able to write is not as important as being able to express, and I think they can do that. And I guess getting it on paper, whether keyboard or whatever, is their choice.
Okay, thank you, Barry. I mean, the other point to finish on that, which is problematic, is that unfortunately or otherwise, that there's also access to forms of electronic media which actually make the recording of particular events maybe too available, in the sense of the horrific nature of what happens in war. Look, I think it has been I've been doing these each fortnight all year, and I certainly could hear a pin drop in here this evening. Clearly people very interested in not only the text that you're studying, but also Barry's experience himself as a writer and as a person who's spent so much time in Vietnam. So I want to do two things. Obviously, I want you to close and give Barry a wonderful round of applause. But also, as we also say here when we finish, we hope you do very well in VCE this year. We hope you're very successful. And we wish you all the best. And please come up and talk to Barry afterwards if you wish to. So please thank Barry.
Thank you.